Hey everyone! Today we are talking about political campaigns and the media. And I love to begin a presentation like this by showing you a graph that is very easy to interpret. And that is a graph where it starts at the bottom and it goes up to a higher level. This is a graph from OpenSecrets.org, which is an organization that tracks campaign spending, looking at outside spending, that is spending that is not spent by political parties as a percent of total federal election spending. You'll see that that number is increasing over time. That's really the nutshell of what I want to talk about today, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a backstory that will get us to, I think, a better understanding of this trend as we go along. So historically, if we were to think about campaigns in the media, we don't observe a situation like this with this incredibly increased rate of outside spending. If we go all the way back to the very first elections in the United States, all the way back to the age of federalism, as it were, we can think about how media organizations as these linkage institutions were extraordinarily intertwined with political parties. And so the Federalist Party, to the extent you could call it a party, by the time it sort of coalesces into one, it actually becomes highly linked to specific media organizations. The Anti-Federalists, who would eventually sort of organize and turn into the Democratic Republican Party, also had their own set of newspapers. Primarily, these were intended for elite audiences. They were designed to help political elites communicate at the state levels and in the Capitol and the Congress. Slowly, however, we'll see that both the media organizations and the parties themselves begin to evolve. And so we see here a cartoon from the first sort of party system where essentially this "oh grab me," which is actually an anagram of the word embargo, this embargo essentially that the Federalists attempted to impose, turns out to be very unpopular despite their beliefs that it would be popular. So damn how he nicks him, right? This "oh grab me," that is, this embargo, is hurting commerce. And so we see already some opposition forming in what would eventually become the Democratic-Republican opposition to the Federalists. As we go, though, as I just mentioned, we get this tripartite or three-part model of parties. And this, essentially by the age of Jackson, you might say, by Andrew Jackson's tenure in office, we start to see this model evolve into its full form, in which we have a party in government, which is something that started to evolve early in the Federalist tenure, in the even as early as the 1790s, where we had elite occupants of government positions starting to form factions, essentially take sides in a partisan struggle. It wasn't until a little bit later, though, that we started to evolve what's called a party organization. That is, the Jacksonian Democrats and others started to realize that they might be able to create a party system outside of just the halls of Congress that would serve to actually help get more representatives of that party elected to the Congress. And so party organizations began to develop naturally as this way to essentially tip the scales in favor of your party. If you had more partisans in office, it seems extremely obvious to us now, but if you get more people that think like you in office, then you're more likely to win votes. And so the party organization is formed in an effort to get these individuals elected. Then finally, actually a fairly latecomer to this tripartite model is actually the idea that partisan voters might become loyal to these different parties. And so, this is kind of the most recent development where we, as individuals, develop psychological attachments to political parties. But altogether, you can see how these three different layers of a party organization in modern politics function to determine who gets elected. Right? We have the party in government working to essentially make things more favorable for their party through their votes and through their operations in Congress. We have the party organization, which is really the subject of what we'll be talking about for the rest of this discussion. And then finally, we have these rank and file voters who are seeking linkage. They're seeking linkage to the party in government. And so if you think about it, this party organization is in fact a linkage institution, much like the linkage institutions that we've spoken about in the past in this course, namely media organizations. So the party organization chiefly serves to link these rank and file voters and develop and inculcate their loyalty in order to influence who gets elected at the end of the day. So here we can see, another political cartoon. We've got all kinds of cartoons today to look at. Public confidence in the stability of the Jackson administration is toppling, as you see Van Buren and the rest of the so-called kitchen cabinet, the rats leaving a falling house as they run away from Jackson. Again, a critical and negative political cartoon in an anti-Jackson newspaper. Here's another anti-Jackson cartoon. It says, "To the victors belong the spoils." And you see Andrew Jackson. Of course, there's a famous statue of Jackson riding a horse in New Orleans that you may be able to see if you've ever been to New Orleans, to that square there. This is, of course, a take on that statue where Jackson is riding a pig who is snuffing around in the ground for plunder, bribery, fraud, and spoils. So this is, again, a very negative cartoon indeed. And again, this is to highlight the fact that soon after this tripartite model of parties started to really get going in the United States, as early as the 1820s, we started to see throughout that period, all the way up until the early 1900s even, political parties becoming incredibly strong and entrenched, especially at the local level. So, we think about the Solid South and the one-party democratic rule of the South for many, many years. That's a good example of that. We can also look to other examples in the North, in large cities, and the control of boss politics, where we had people like Boss Tweed in New York, making it nearly impossible for you to run for office and win elections unless you sort of kiss the ring and pledge your loyalty, and eventually pledge to do things in office to give kickbacks to those bosses. And so patronage is sort of the beginning of the evolution of that machine politics era, where essentially loyal individuals would enter into the administration and receive cushy government jobs in response to their loyalty. And so from the Jacksonian spoil system all the way through the rest of the 19th century, we saw the spoil system and patronage become a key feature of politics, and certainly not without substantial criticism, as we've seen. So essentially, from a lot of American history, politics was incredibly corrupt. Right? We had kickbacks, we had this one-party rule in all sorts of different places, and even elections were essentially non-affairs, where we had bribery, we had ballot stuffing, we had all kinds of other chicanery being practiced by one-party sort of dominant localities, resulting in obviously an intense decline in public confidence in government. So this was really, I think, the zenith of the power of political parties. And as we might imagine, actually giving that much power to these parties in certain places destroys the ability for linkage to function. Right? There's absolutely no accountability, essentially, from politicians to voters in this sense, except for the voters who are in on the take, essentially part of this spoils system. So this is not a great example of linkage, but it is a time in American history when parties were incredibly strong. However, we have a steamroller that we can see here in another political cartoon from early in the Progressive era. You'll see, interestingly, that it's women that are driving the steamroller. Right? This is actually, it says here, this sash that the woman in the center here is wearing, it says the West, which is very interesting, and the other ones are wearing equal suffrage sashes. You see this Progress steamroller is crushing the opposition. This was a very specific era in American politics in which the Progressive era, which sort of went part and parcel with reforms in media, as we've talked about a little bit, right? The rise of this responsible journalism model, the rise of women's suffrage, and several other developments, notably in education. The work of Dewey, for example, helped to push forward a system where we started to break down those party bosses and the spoils system and patronage politics. And the number one way that was achieved by this progressive movement was a turn towards the primary and caucus system that we have today. And so essentially, by making primaries contestable by multiple candidates and turning the decisions about who to nominate to voters, it turns out that actually helped to substantially break down the power of party bosses, because no longer were they capable of single-handedly determining who got to run in a general election against a very weak opponent. So instead, right, what we had is the evolution of a modern campaign, where you actually had to run against strong opponents, even within a primary, in order to win office. And so really the distillation of this kind of idea is something that's familiar to us now, Partisans who want to run for office need to win the hearts and minds of voters, not the favor of powerful bosses. So the Progressive Era reforms really changed a lot in America, most notably not just the women's suffrage, of course, the ability of women to vote and the guarantee at the federal level through constitutional amendment, but also changes to the media and to voting itself. Then we arrive at an era of the modern party, and you can see here this is another much more modern political cartoon where the Democratic National Convention, where Barack Obama is going to accept the nomination. You can see here in big letters it says featuring Hillary and Bill Clinton, indicating now that in the modern era, we have personalities starting to really take center stage, no pun intended, in partisan politics. And so what we've seen is over time, the party in government has certainly strengthened dramatically. We've seen that sort of roll call votes in Congress are incredibly strongly influenced by whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. And also the psychology of the party in the electorate has strengthened substantially. By that, I mean that individuals are now more intensely partisan. There are Republican and Democratic sort of partisan loyalties that are becoming stronger and more psychologically impactful than ever before. This other piece of the model, the party organization, that middle piece, the linkage institution that we've been talking about, it is actually transformed in a very important way. And by that, a lot of scholars point to the change from what we might call a party-centered campaign to a candidate-centered campaign. And so again, I think this kind of symbolizes this idea that it's really about strong, powerful personalities within these party organizations that determine a lot of the power structures today. So no longer do we have strong party machines where the party organization is incredibly strong. This is something a little bit different. This is actually candidates themselves, candidates taking center stage and playing an important role in determining who gets what in party politics. And in fact, these candidate-centered campaigns, and here's another political cartoon that sort of highlights this. Here's Bernie Sanders over here, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, saying, "I'm starting a political revolution," and then moderates over here turning to Biden and saying, "Thanks, we're only interested in regime change," right? This kind of differentiation between the Sanders camp among the Democrats and Biden, who represents probably a more mainstream Democrat, really shows, I think, the weakness of modern party organizations. Because, as you might imagine, in previous iterations of a party system, a major challenge to the party regime or to the party organization by this upstart outsider candidate would probably be shut down a lot more quickly by a strong party organization. They would say, no, like we do things a certain way. We have our favorite candidates, and we're going to make sure that they ultimately get the most attention and the most favor. Now we have, these outsider candidates. I mean, Bernie Sanders, even in Congress runs as an independent, breaking down the door and saying, hey, this is a fair, contest. I should be allowed to speak my piece as well. And in the resulting primaries, we have intense clashes. And so, I mean, obviously I've got a Bernie versus the field kind of cartoon here, but we could, of course, think back to 2016 as well, when Trump breaks in as this outsider candidate in the Republican Party. And similarly, right, there's a sort of insider-outsider divide here. And so this really shows to us that candidates themselves, right, a candidate like Bernie Sanders, who's got this sort of loyal following of strong adherents, and a candidate like Trump, who's able to, do this kind of same outsider game, they're able to really expose the weakness of these modern party organizations. Nominating conventions then become, as I've just mentioned, a really, really, really intense affair where we see a lot of fireworks. And of course, it should not be lost on us as students of media and politics that these are, of course, televised, highly sort of mediated affairs where the cameras are trained on these candidates for months, and votes go from state to state as we tally up the various votes in favor of the candidates. And so we have all these switches, and the leaderboard shifts all the time as different states vote in their primaries and caucuses. It's a very intense process, and it's something that political junkies get to really watch and consume through televised and internet content over many, many months. So a candidate-centered campaign is in itself a highly mediated campaign, and one in which media organizations play an important role in helping determine who ends up getting elected. However, there's one more development that needs to be discussed, and here we have Karl Rove, obviously, who's thought of as like sort of one of the GOP's like insider masterminds, right? And here you can see the sort of elephant representing the GOP comes up to the top here of the mountain where the guru is sitting, and they say, oh, holy crap, the meaning of the GOP is Karl Rove, right? It's actually about political consultants and not about any policy. We're really in trouble. And certainly this is highlighting Karl Rove and the Republicans, but a similar cartoon could probably be made about Democratic consultants as well. A consultant-centered campaign is all about this class of professionals who are working to elect candidates. It's now over $1 billion campaign every election cycle. You have to hire these people to get elected, and that's why, to a large extent, you have to have so much spending in order to get this done. Outside spending even further intensifies this reliance on the industry, because as super PACs and other outside spending organizations spend money, what they're essentially doing is they're spending money on political advertisements almost exclusively. And who creates political advertisements but additional campaign consultants and individuals working in what's called Beltway Washington, right? So these big firms that are doing political communications, these are now, according to scholars, really the most important sort of piece of the campaign puzzle. No longer do we have a party-centered campaign. No longer do we maybe even have a candidate-centered campaign. Now what we really have is a consultant-driven campaign, which is technical and relies upon advanced statistics and relies upon a whole host of very, very well-paid and very important consultants to get candidates elected. And so, again, the major goal of a consultant enterprise is ultimately to devise successful campaign communications. And so, again, as media and politics scholars, we can start to look at this and ask some big questions, right? First, what if parties find themselves more and more vulnerable to the candidate and their campaign vehicle through consultant organizations? Well, if this is true, we have to remember that party organizations have historically been viewed as these key linkage institutions, the thing that helps to bridge the gap between ordinary rank-and-file citizens and government. And so if party organizations help to channel the preferences of the public to help determine who gets elected, all of a sudden we have a weakening, a decay of that linkage, and a replacement, ultimately. And while in previous iterations of this class even, we might have said, actually, what's really happening is media are coming to play a more important linkage role than parties. We're now having a media-centered campaign where the television cameras and the CBS News anchors are really the kingmakers. Right? We talked about this theory that the fourth estate is a kingmaker. They're the ones who are really in charge of determining who gets to win elections through the way they present political candidates. Now we actually have another layer, because we know from Module 4 that these legacy media institutions are substantially weakening. And so both parties and media institutions are weakening. We have fewer and fewer journalists on the payrolls. We have more and more of a struggle for attention. We have the decay of this responsible journalism model. We have a lack of regulations leading to a rise of intensely competitive niche, the long tail, essentially, of news outlets, meaning that the big three essentially aren't so big anymore in comparison to the field. The question that boils down ultimately in this discussion is who has the power today to determine who wins elections. It's not legacy party organizations, maybe. It's not legacy media organizations. It's not even maybe candidates in the largest sense. I think that many scholars are now pointing to this, and we can see this in the reading today, that really what this is all about is the Sue money, as this political cartoon indicates, the unlimited special interest cash that arises from outside spending. And so going all the way back to the first slide of this presentation, we can think about the idea that in today's politics, these linkage institutions have eroded substantially, and now we're in a much less predictable environment where really this has a lot to do with large amounts of outside campaign spending having a substantial influence on who wins elections. So I know that's a lot to mull over. I hope that you think critically about linkage as you do this week's readings. Follow me along to the next video, and we'll talk a little bit about some more topics in campaigns and politics. See you soon.